But in general, I would say, if you want to see it historically accurate or depicted more accurately, watch Alexander, the movie from Oliver Stone. You can see that he put much more effort in his research and listened to his advisors, his historical advisors, and then Netflixed it. Hello and welcome to Eliminative History. I'm happy you found your way here to my channel. In general, I speak about ancient Greece, especially ancient Greece, but also about the ancient world. And today, as you may have noticed from the thumbnail and from the title and from the introduction, I will speak about Netflix documentary about Alexander the Great, but only the first episode, because I already made so much notes on my remarkable that I thought, okay, there is enough to talk about in one video. Also, as you may have noticed, English is not my first language. I actually speak German, that's my mother tongue, and I have a channel in German already. So I will sometimes make pronunciation mistakes or grammar mistakes, and I hope you go easy on me. I will pronounce names more German-like and specific historical concepts maybe. Still, I hope you enjoy it, and I made the chapters. I did the chapters in the description, and you can also see it on the timeline. You can jump to the categories or the topics that you're more interested in and enjoy those, and don't have to watch the others, but you can watch them still. So grab your coffee like I did and just sip, I love it. Enjoy my review of Alexander. Still, before we start, I tell you how I will build this up. I will talk about the people that are represented, the historical people, especially Alexander, Olympias, and Philip II, and go a little bit into Attalos and Darius and Stadata. And I will also go into historical concepts and historical situations and things that happened and are told in the documentary, like from the very, very controversial topic of homosexuality, and also some conceptions or topics that are, in my opinion, totally misrepresented and shouldn't be presented in that way in a documentary, in my opinion, because a documentary is about telling or being transparent about what we know and what we don't know, what the concepts of specific topics were of people in the ancient world. And Macedon already made a really good video about the first episode, and he goes a lot more into detail, especially about this homosexuality or in general the sexuality regarding Alexander. So please watch this video because I won't go into that much detail. One of the first things that I've noticed before even starting was the title about the boy king. And also Darius talks very dismissively about the boy king of Macedon, and that's so wrong. It's just, even nowadays, a 20-year-old is considered an adult male, and especially in ancient Greece, where you had to grow up much earlier and were considered an adult much earlier. It's totally wrong, even for Persia. Alexander was definitely considered an adult male for ancient Greece and ancient Persia. Especially boys, they were considered men or becoming men when they hit puberty and got their first beard, the first hair, the first facial hair and body hair. You have to know, even women were considered grown up much earlier than nowadays. Also when they hit puberty, kind of. So this is framed and presented totally wrong. And I don't get it why they do that. I mean, there were boy kings in ancient Macedon and in other kingdoms, like Alexander's cousin Amyntas. He was 3 years old when his father, Alexander's uncle, died. And so Philip, Alexander's father, took over guardianship for Amyntas and ruled Macedon in his name, but then got rid of him. He kept him alive, but he took over the throne. And so Philip became king. We also see from later Macedonian kings and general kings, when they hit a certain age, around 15 to 16, they are no longer under the guardianship of their parents, especially their mothers. So we consider them being a grown-up or adult male at the latest at 18 years old, even if not earlier. Total misrepresentation, in my opinion. And now we also go to the next one that that caught my attention, and that's the use of nicknames. Macedon already spoke about it, and I really hated it too, to be honest. I mean, okay, at the end, we cannot say for sure that they didn't use it. We only know how they did write, and like in any language, people don't speak like they write. We know that ancient Greeks used nicknames, but not in the way that we do it today, like with our first name and our family name, that are short versions maybe of that. Like, for example, Lies of Corinth. There were two Lies of Corinth, both famous heteras. One of the Lies had the nickname Axine because of her way to speak, her harsh way to speak, and her sharp words cutting into the person's ego, I would say. So nicknames were sometimes given because of the character traits or your looks that were maybe prominent or made you stand out from others. And nicknames were also influenced not only by being nice to you, but were also meant to be in a dismissive way, and some just took it and thought, yeah, okay, that's my nickname now. Axine or Fryne. Fryne, for example, means the toad, and that's not a very nice name for a beautiful woman or a hetere. It was definitely not meant to compliment her. When they call Ptolemaios tall, I mean, that's kind of random. I mean, maybe if Ptolemaios had a nickname, it would be totally different than tall. It's influenced by our modern perception, how we make nicknames from names. We know that there were longer names and shorter versions of those names, meaning the same thing. So we know that people used names but made them shorter in specific regions or in specific times during ancient Greece. But they were still not considered nicknames. One of the first things I noticed when they say, I mean, I have to say that I watched it in German, and I suppose it also said in English. I only watched a few scenes in English. That Alexander had two really, really close friends, and those were Hephaestion and Ptolemaios. Ptolemy. I will probably say Ptolemaios very often. I was wondering because, Hephaestion was a very, very close friend of Alexander that is often highlighted also in the sources about Alexander. I was still a little bit confused because, of course, Ptolemy was a close friend, but not maybe one of his two closest. Alexander in general grew up with so-called heteroi, like companions, and they were from noble Macedonian families, and they kind of accompanied him and went through the same teachings as him and the same training. Others that are mentioned early on in Alexander's life are Perdiccas and Lysimachos. Those two also chased down Philip's murderer, Pausanias, and killed him, like accurately depicted in the movie Alexander. It's strange for me because in the movie Alexander, I think they did a better job to highlight that he also had friendships with others. I mean, of course, Ptolemy, because it's told from his point of view. Ptolemy said that he wrote about Alexander's life, and we have to be very careful about that, because after Alexander's death, some of his companions and others, they all wanted to have their share. Some may have highlighted or made the relationship between them and Alexander more than it actually was, and it all served the purpose of legitimate their own claim for a throne, or their own claim to be more legit than the other, or follow me more because I was the more best friend of Alexander than Perdiccas. Another thing I have noticed is that they said that Aigai, I don't say the English name, Aigai is the capital of Macedonia, and I was very confused at the beginning because I didn't learn that in my studies in history. And then I read into it because for me it was always Pella. You can also see it in the movie of Alexander. Didn't find any absolute saying of the sources because I have to judge from the sources and not what scholars say 100 and 1,000 years afterwards. But the scholars like Xenophon state definitely that Pella was the biggest city in Macedon in the 4th century BC and even bigger than Aigai. They also say that Aigai, of course, was very important. It was kind of the ancestral home of the royal house of the Argiads, the house that Philip and Alexander belonged to. But it was not where Alexander grew up. in Pella is first mentioned in Herodotus during the Persian Wars. Pella was a very, very important city, especially for commerce. Back then, it had a river which was connected to the ocean, so it was situated in a very strategic, important area. Under Archelaus I, it was already pushed, built out, and he got architects, artists, philosophers, poets to Pella to kind of build the city and to make it very important. We definitely can say that under Philip II, who was born in Pella, Pella was his seat of ruling. It was not Aigai. So in that kind of sense, you can say that Pella was kind of the capital. It's not said, and we also have to be very cautious with this term. And Alexander was definitely born in it, and he definitely grew up in Pella. There was a big palace that was constructed, enlarged in the later years, and affirmed by other kings like Philip's father, I think. So it's very confusing that they say, yeah, I'm back home, kind of, Alexander. I mean, of course, you can talk about Aigai. It's an important city. And yes, Philip died there, and it was still important, and all the royal family graves are situated in Aigai. Philip himself and other relatives of Alexander are buried there. But to say that it was the capital, it's far-fetched, in my opinion, and especially that it's the home of Alexander. Reality is that he was born in Pella, he grew up there, he received his training there, so he would probably more consider Pella his home, and it at the end it was also his seat of ruling, like his father before him. I'm confused that they are not transparent about it and don't mention Pella at all, because it was a very, very important city in in the Hellenistic times and even before that. Yes, what is correct is that Philip was murdered there during the wedding festivities of his daughter Cleopatra. Cleopatra was his daughter with Olympias and therefore the full-blooded sister of Alexander. I made a video about her in German. If you want to, I can do an English version of her. I think she's a very fascinating person, and like many other people related to Alexander, she had a very tragic end. Like said, she was married there. But the one thing that I really, really couldn't get why they say that, really, is that it's mentioned that she was married to a warlord, and it's kind of like it's a no-name, and I'm like, what? Because that's not some random warlord who was not important. It was actually Alexander I of the kingdom of Macedon, and Alexander I was the uncle of Cleopatra and Alexander, and the brother of Olympias. Olympias and Alexander I, I say Alexandros because then it's getting confusing. Alexandros and Olympias, they are of Epirus. The kingdom of Epirus, they were their own distinct kingdom who were allied with the Macedons for a few years, and they were from the ancient royal family of the Molossians, who ruled Epirus for, I think, 200 years already around the time. I have to look it up. Maybe I'm telling absolute lies right now, I don't know. But they were ruling Epirus for a very, very long time and for many generations. And Olympia's marriage to Philip itself was even a political one, probably a political one, to make an alliance between those two kingdoms, because they had a common enemy too. Those were the Illyrians in the north. And when this quarrel happened, or this dispute between Philip and Alexander and Attalos, Alexander went to Illyria, and Olympias went into exile back to her home country, to her brother, who was king there, in Epirus. It's also suspected, and it's interesting that they don't mention it, even though they mention the fight between Philip and Alexander, that this marriage in Aigai was also politically motivated, also in some extent by this dispute they had, because Olympias went back to Epirus, and they had this alliance. And so Philip, who was already planning his attack on Persia, and who also had enemies in ancient Greece and in his borders, wanted to make sure that he didn't have to fight any wars at home while he was gone in Persia. So his kingdom had to be secure. So when Olympias went to her brother, he maybe had to fear that his alliance with Epirus would be very fragile and maybe even result into Epirus invading Macedon. It was in his political interest that they would renew their alliance, so he didn't have to worry about this side of his border. Therefore, the alliance in the form of a marriage between Cleopatra, his daughter with Olympias, and Alexander, who was already his brother-in-law, was arranged. So about that, not some random warlord, a king of a sovereign kingdom. And now I will dive into the depictions of our historical people like Alexander. And the first one is Alexander himself and his looks that are often talked about. In both the film and the documentary, he is portrayed as blonde, one with dark eyes, because I think Colin Farrell has dark eyes, and blue eyes. I personally don't care at all which eye color or hair color he has, but we will judge that from the depictions and descriptions we have of Alexander. Alexander is described by Plutarch and Aelian, and both authors are born over 200 years, I think, after Alexander. Plutarch is in the 1st century BC and Aelian from the 2nd to 1st century BC. They describe him as fair in complexion. I don't care about that. I mean, he trained a lot, he was outside a lot, he was probably very tanned. Alexander's hair color is often described as xanthine, and I don't know if I pronounced it right, even in ancient Greece, xanthine, and that means kind of yellowish, more fair, fairer, or in German I would say the hell. How do you say that? Light? More light? I don't know. Anyways, he's described with those words. But we have to be very, very careful because, ancient Greeks had a very different concepts regarding concepts we have today. They didn't imagine a very blonde North European, Middle European guy or woman. They associated it with lighter hair, light brown hair or yellowish hair, reddish brown hair. And if we look at the frescoes, one from Pompeii, which was of course many years after Alexander's death, he's depicted as having brown hair, light brown hair to brown hair with dark eyes. And interestingly, and I didn't know that before I did my research, there is a depiction of Alexander during his lifetime from the grave of Philip II. It depicts a hunting scene and supposedly Alexander on a horse. And there he's also depicted with light brown hair and dark eyes. And he also wears some colorful clothing, something I didn't see on men during the documentary. We can assume that Alexander probably had dark hair or maybe light brown hair and dark eyes. At the end, I don't really care which hair color he has, but I'm totally biased regarding that because I love the movie Alexander, so I'm used to it. But it would also maybe be nice to see a dark-haired Alexander or a brown-haired Alexander, because it would be much, much closer to the depictions we actually have of him. Now we come to a very controversial topic regarding Alexander's sexuality and his relationship to Hephaestion. And one of the main things I have to say about that is that ancient Greeks did see things just very differently than us. Alone the concept of homosexuality, I mean, it exists, but not in a sense that we understand it or we even name it. Like, homosexuality is a word that didn't exist in ancient Greece. Having intercourse is just having intercourse. It was more important which role you had during intercourse, like the active or passive role. We also have to be very careful about that because our main sources come from Athens, so we don't know exactly maybe how ancient Macedon saw it. But in ancient Athens, it is seen okay if the guy was younger, like this pedestry relationships, that it's okay if he takes more the passive role and with the older guy, because the hierarchy is also very, very clear. But it's frowned upon and was very much judged if two adult males were in a relationship with each other, especially two males from the same social class. One of the men had to take the passive role, and in Athenian society at least, the passive role was women. So if you took upon the passive role during the act, you also made yourself a woman, and that was not something very honorable, or that was something looked down upon. That's not something a real man would do. A real man would be active doing it with a man, with his thing. Yeah, that's that. But it's a very, very complex topic, and I'm very fascinated by it, and I made a post about it in my Instagram too. And Metatron made a really good researched video about homosexuality in general in ancient Greece, so look it up. But what I can definitely say, what also Macedon already said in his video, is Alexander really treated himself. Like mentioned in the sources, he treated himself with women and men, and he just enjoyed living also with other drugs. Yeah, we can assume pretty much that he had at least sexual relations with men. Bagoas is mentioned very, very prominently because he kissed him openly in front of other people, and it's mentioned in the sources too. Hephaestion is another thing. I mean, it's told that they themselves saw themselves as Achilles and Patroclus, reborn kind of. And Achilles and Patroclus are also to have been said as being lovers. It's not clearly stated, but maybe they had a romantic and sexual relationship. From what I read in the sources, it's not definitely stated, but it could be. And of course, we have this other thing, or this other problem, that Hephaestion maybe had to make himself passive, or maybe sometimes even Alexander. That was something Athenians looked down upon, or at least those who read about it. Maybe it wasn't a problem at all for Macedonians. Maybe they saw it differently than Athenians regarding relationships between two adult males, and for them it wasn't a big thing. It was not that bad to get passive or to take up on the passive role during the act. It's even said that Attalos, the general that is killed at the end of the documentary, is said to have had a male lover. Like I said, the concept of relationships and being sexual is completely different to us today, to sexual identity. Yeah, Alexander treated himself. No matter your sex or your gender, he didn't care. Just like beautiful people, maybe, and alcohol. A very interesting sentence, and I can only judge it from German. I think he said it in English too. In the documentary is when Alexander says after his ascension to the throne and Cleopatra Eurydice, the seventh wife of his father, finished herself, he says that he doesn't want to be seen as illegitimate. For me, that was a strange assumption or sentence to say, because murder and shedding blood of your enemies was casual Macedonian thing when you wanted to throne or want to legitimate your claim to the thrones and wanted to get rid of other claimants. Even Philip II himself went after his three half-brothers because to him it was too dangerous to keep them alive, as they also had a claim to the Macedonian throne, and so he got rid of them. It was kind of pretty common to get rid of your brothers or even maybe your father and or son and other male relatives to legitimate your own claim to the throne and to make sure that nobody is there to fight against you. For what I've also read from the sources, Alexander had a problem with Olympias scheming against Cleopatra Eurydice. Yeah, women in general were not seen that much of a threat to the throne. Of course, it was not that secure even as a woman sometimes. Alexander, for example, got rid of his cousin Amyntas. I mentioned before that Amyntas was the king at 3 years old, and Philip, his uncle, father of Alexander, took over the guardianship and eventually took over the throne himself. But he kept Amyntas alive and even married him to his oldest daughter, Cunane. And when Alexander became king, he got rid of his cousin Amyntas because he was actually the king before him and his father, and therefore had a claim to the throne, a legitimate, because his own father was Perdiccas and he was the king of Macedon over 30 years ago, or over 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. He didn't get rid of his brother though, because his brother was never considered a real option for the throne, even by Philip. But that's another topic. Bloodshed and murder is Macedonian business as usual when you ascend the throne, so I don't know. And now to Olympias. In general, about Olympias' costume, I'm very confused. There's a lot of Macedonian jewelry. Hate that word. We know how the earrings and all this other jewelry looked like. You know what I mean. I just cannot pronounce that. Schmuck in German. And there's a lot in it, and it's in gold. So I don't know why they chose some weird, very weird things. Metatron already pointed it out. And also regarding her hairstyles and costumes, maybe I'm totally mistaken. I went to the Museum of Pella and I didn't see any of that there, because we have a lot of evidence what women, unmarried women, married women, and women from higher social status wore. Yeah. In general, her outfits and her hairstyle seems very modern to me. It seems more like the Real Housewives of Beverly, Macedon, Pella. We have good evidence about the hairstyle that women wore from different social status and different time periods throughout Greek history. Olympias is depicted as being at Aigai, being at the wedding of her daughter, but she wasn't actually there because she was still in exile in Epirus and only came back after Alexander ascended the throne. And now about the historical depiction of Philip, because in my opinion it was one of the Please watch Oliver Stone's Alexander, because here you have an accurate depiction of how he looked like. I mean, his most prominent feature in the face was, even stated in sources and what we know from reconstruction of his skull, that he only had one eye. And he had a beard, because beards were very trendy during his lifetime. Beards only became less trendy during Alexander's reign. We can see it from the statues and afterwards. And also the hair he wears is quite Romanish. It reminds you more of Romans. I mean, we cannot exclude that some Macedonians and Greeks wore very short hair. But I would have, if you told me he was Caesar, I would have believed him. Also funny, I don't know if they say it in English, but they say that Philip had a midlife crisis and therefore married a very young Macedonian woman. I mean, could be maybe. But they say he married a Macedonian princess. And that was the point where I was like, excuse me. That framing is quite interesting because it's wrong. Later in the documentary, when it's about Attalos and his correspondence and when Alexander got rid of him, it's said that his niece was a wife to Philip. And me, as someone who watches it, wouldn't know that the wife that was mentioned very early that Philip was married to as his 7th wife is this niece of Attalos. And I was so confused because I was like, hey, she was just the niece of Attalos and she was not a Macedonian princess. And I looked into the sources and nowhere it stated that she was kind of related distinctively to the royal house and even related to maybe the other former smaller Macedonian royal houses and kingdoms, because there were smaller kingdoms before the Aigai took over the whole thing. I was confused about this statement because it's just wrong. Attalos also is not named as having any relation to the Macedonian royal house. Maybe you have some other sources I didn't find because I looked it up in German and English and I couldn't find it. It's said nowhere. From my knowledge, I have to say that's just wrong. She was from an aristocratic Macedonian family, which doesn't make it any less legitimate for Philip because, like I said before, it was desired to have maybe a full-blooded Macedonian heir. Yeah, but she was just a regular aristocratic Macedonian woman. As accurately depicted, he and Parmenion, who was actually his father-in-law, were stationed in Asia Minor and / Anatolia. Now, about Attalos' correspondence with Darius, because I didn't know about that. And then I looked into it and I didn't find any mention of that. Only that, yes, Attalos corresponded with someone, but it was not Darius, it was Demosthenes of Athens. And Demosthenes was a very famous Greek rival of Philip II. He was one of the ones that really maybe was very happy about Philip's death. He knew about this dispute Alexander and the personal problem Alexander had with Attalos, and that Attalos just lost his niece to Olympias scheming. So there were some personal reasons there to hate each other. Also, Attalos was very prominent among the Macedonian army, and Alexander knew that. So Demosthenes contacted Attalos and tried to win him over. But also, like depicted in the documentary, Attalos chose Alexander and said he wouldn't betray his king. But at the end, Alexander didn't want to risk anything and knew about the prominence of Attalos among the Macedonian army and feared that he maybe still would want some revenge on Alexander. and so we got rid of him. I understand it when I make a movie. For the narrative and creative freedom, I would understand if they depict it as Darius having correspondence with Attalos. I understand if you don't want to explain who Demosthenes is, but you can still do it, because then it would actually be true and be presented accurately, what we know from sources and what is historically accurate. Because in my opinion, a documentary shouldn't falsify some situations or the relationships with people. Yeah, I'm not that much into Persians, and I didn't want to make this video too long, but I still did some research on it. I was confused or a little bit surprised, because I didn't know that the data was the sister of Darius, and she therefore was his sister wife, like Egyptian style. I was surprised by that. I don't know if all the scholars are sure she is the sister or maybe half sister, but it said that she was the sister of Darius and he married his sister. Yeah, Darius was not the son of the Persian king, but he ascended the throne via force. Like accurately depicted, he only ascended the throne a few months before Alexander. But it's strange to say that two young kings fight against each other, and I wasn't sure if they meant that he was young when he ascended the throne, which would not be true, or if they thought or they wanted to say that both were young rulers, which is also not true. Because Darius, if we assume he was born around 380 BC, which is the date given as his birth date, would actually only be 2 years younger than Philip II, and therefore be much older than Alexander, 25 years or something. I was confused by it a little bit. The framing of another topic is also interesting, because they say, yeah, the Persians were very... In German we say abergläubisch. What is it in English? I have to look it up. Superstitious. Yeah, they were very superstitious, and maybe they didn't intend it, but the framing for me was like, yeah, okay, the Persians were superstitious, but the Greeks not. Greeks were too. In German it's Vogelschau, how the birds were flying. They were interpreting it as a sign of the gods and so on, as a bad or good omen. So superstition was everywhere in the ancient world, and it came in different forms. The costumes, I already said it before, and I think Macedon made a better video than I did, or went into far greater detail, and I won't, to be honest. We have many depictions and sources how women especially dressed, but in general I would say, if you want to see it historically accurate or depicted more accurately, watch Alexander, the movie from Oliver Stone. You can see that he put much more effort in his research and listened to his advisors, his historical advisors, and then Netflixed it. First of all, you see a lot of leather worn by the men. I think that's just a trend that Vikings started. I love the series, but I think it's just Vikings started it and now they take it over. We have depictions also from men, what men wear. We have hunting scenes where you see them even sometimes only dressed in a cloak and really kind of naked, but with a cloak that is white and also with some color. Like the fresco I mentioned before from Philip's grave, where Alexander is supposedly depicted. It's also colorful. He wears something purple, or maybe it was once purple or red. So it's just sad to see that there is no color on the men's costumes at all. They don't seem kind of aristocratic to me. I mean, they were men of high social status, and it's something that you want to present in the public too, because you want the people to see that you're from a higher status. And honestly, wearing all this leather is just too heavy in my opinion. And it's so much nicer for your everyday life to just wear your cloak and chiton or whatever, because it's easier to move, and especially for the climate. I was confused by that. Very confused. That's that. That was my video about Alexander, first episode of the Alexander documentary of Netflix. Thank you so much for listening to it or watching it. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you could follow, and I hope you were able to follow, even though I don't speak English, or English is not my mother tongue. Maybe I will make more videos in English depending about the demand. Like I said before, I already have a German channel, especially talking about Alexander's sisters and his niece, and no, not his mother, and how their life went on after Alexander's death especially. I also have an Instagram channel where I make content about various topics, especially regarding ancient Greece, but also some other ancient civilizations. Look it up, follow me on Instagram. I also have a podcast, but in German only, where I talk about the history of ancient Greece from the beginning, from the Bronze Age to the Hellenistic period. Maybe I plan for the future to do it in English too, because it's a lot of work, and right now I'm just happy if I can do it in German, because I do a lot of research to retell it accurately or talk about it accurately, also regarding accurate research. And if you would be interested in me watching and giving my opinion about the second episode of Alexander's Netflix, I would watch it and do a video on it. If you say you would be interested in my videos about Alexander's sisters, I would redo them in English and retell their stories and their biographies. Until next time, I wish you a very pleasant day. Thank you very much, and bye from Alternative History.